Well, now everyone can move on, my daughter-in-law Rachel said with a small satisfied smile just minutes after my late husband's inheritance had been divided, and in that moment I realized something colder than grief. My family hadn't just lost a husband and a father, they had quietly decided they no longer needed me. My name is Margaret Whitmore. I'm 72 years old, and until a few weeks ago I believed my life was still wrapped tightly inside the word family. My husband Thomas and I had been married for 48 years. We built our home in a quiet Ohio suburb back when houses cost less than $30,000 and the maple tree in the front yard was thin enough to bend in the wind. Now that tree was taller than the roof and our home was worth more than I could ever have imagined, but somehow, after the paperwork was signed and the lawyer closed his leather folder, that same house suddenly felt too large and strangely unfamiliar. The meeting had taken place in a downtown law office with tall windows and a long walnut conference table that could easily seat 12 people, though that afternoon only 5 chairs were filled: my son Daniel, his wife Rachel, my daughter Laura, the family attorney Mr. Henderson, and me. I remember the quiet ticking of a wall clock as the documents were passed across the table. Thomas had always been careful with money, the sort of man who kept neat folders in the study and balanced the checkbook every Sunday morning. Even during the last year, when his health had begun to fail, he insisted on handling every detail himself. "Everything's organized, Maggie," he told me once while standing in the doorway of the kitchen. "No one will have to worry." At the time I thought he meant the children. I never imagined he might have meant me. When Mr. Henderson finished explaining the distribution of the estate, Daniel leaned back in his chair and nodded slowly as if reviewing a business report. Laura glanced at her phone almost immediately, her expression already distracted. Rachel was the only one who looked genuinely pleased, though she tried to hide it behind polite sympathy. She reached over and squeezed Daniel's arm. "It's good everything is settled," she said. Her voice was warm, but there was something final about the way she said the word. Settled. The meeting ended quickly after that. Papers were signed, hands were shaken, and chairs scraped softly against the floor as everyone prepared to leave. I stayed seated a moment longer than the others, still absorbing the quiet emptiness that had followed Thomas's absence for the past 3 weeks. Losing a husband after nearly half a century is like losing the background music of your life. You suddenly hear how quiet everything truly is. I expected someone to pause, maybe ask if I needed a ride home, or suggest we have dinner together like families do after difficult days. Instead, Daniel gathered his coat, Laura checked the time, and Rachel picked up her handbag. That was when she said it. "Well, now everyone can move on." She didn't say it loudly, and perhaps she didn't intend for the words to sound so sharp, but the sentence landed in the room like a door quietly closing. Daniel gave a small laugh under his breath, the kind people make when they're eager to leave an uncomfortable place. Laura simply nodded. No one looked at me. I walked out of the building alone a few minutes later, stepping into the cool October air. The afternoon sun reflected off the glass towers across the street, and for a moment I had to shield my eyes with my hand. Traffic moved slowly along the avenue, and somewhere down the block a food cart vendor was calling out orders. The city continued exactly as it had before, but something inside my life had shifted slightly off balance. I drove home in my old silver Buick, the same car Thomas and I bought 7 years ago after he finally convinced me we deserved something reliable. The house greeted me with the same quiet it had held since the funeral. I hung my coat in the hallway and stood for a moment in the living room, looking at the armchair where Thomas used to sit every evening with the newspaper folded across his lap. The lamp beside the chair was still on from the night before. I turned it off and the room dimmed instantly. Over the next few days something strange began to happen. The phone stayed silent. No messages. No quick check-ins. Daniel usually called every Sunday, but Sunday passed with nothing more than the hum of the refrigerator and the distant sound of lawn mowers in neighboring yards. Laura had always been busy, but even she normally sent a text or two during the week. This time there was only quiet. At first I told myself everyone was simply adjusting, that grief affects people differently. I made tea in the mornings, watered the plants on the back porch, and tried not to notice how large the house felt when the sun went down. But by the end of the week I began to understand something I hadn't expected to learn at my age. When the inheritance was divided, my children hadn't just taken their portions of the estate. They had taken their sense of obligation with them. And somewhere in the silence that followed, the woman who had spent her life raising them slowly began to realize she had become an afterthought. The silence inside the house did not arrive all at once. It settled slowly, like dust in a room that no one enters anymore. During the first few days after the meeting with the lawyer, I convinced myself that my children were simply busy returning to their normal routines. Daniel worked long hours at a consulting firm in Columbus, and Laura had always been juggling her career and her 2 teenagers. Life moved quickly for people in their 40s and 50s. I understood that. At least that was what I told myself each morning while the coffee brewed in the kitchen. My mornings had always begun early. Even now, at 72, my body still woke at 6 o'clock without the help of an alarm. For nearly 5 decades Thomas had been the first sound of the day, shuffling into the kitchen in his slippers, humming softly while the kettle heated. Now the kitchen greeted me with the low mechanical hum of the refrigerator and the quiet tick of the clock above the stove. I poured 1 cup of coffee instead of 2. The small change felt larger than I expected. I kept looking at the second mug in the cabinet before closing the door again. On Wednesday afternoon I decided to call Daniel. The phone rang 5 times before his voicemail answered with his familiar cheerful greeting. I left a short message, nothing dramatic. I simply asked how he was doing and said that I hoped work was not too stressful. I waited for a call back that evening. None came. The following morning I checked my phone again, certain that I must have missed it. The screen remained empty. By Friday I had called Laura as well. Her phone rang only twice before sending me to voicemail. I left another polite message, the sort mothers have been leaving their children for generations. I said that I had been thinking about her and that I hoped the children were doing well in school. I mentioned that the leaves on the maple tree in the front yard had already begun to turn bright orange. Laura always loved autumn. That message also remained unanswered. I began to notice other small things that had changed. My grandson Ethan used to stop by every other Saturday after soccer practice because our house was only 10 minutes from the field. He liked the oatmeal cookies I baked, and Thomas had always kept a jar of them on the kitchen counter just for him. The jar was still there now, but the cookies inside remained untouched. Another Saturday came and went. No knock on the door. On Sunday afternoon I drove to the grocery store on Main Street. It was the same store Thomas and I had visited for years. I walked slowly through the aisles, pushing the cart past shelves of cereal boxes and canned soup. At the dairy section I instinctively reached for the larger carton of milk before remembering that there was only one person drinking it now. I placed the carton back and chose the smallest one instead. When you live alone, even a gallon of milk feels like too much. The cashier, a young man with tired eyes and a name tag that said Brandon, asked how my day was going. I smiled politely and told him everything was fine. It was the same answer people give when they do not wish to explain something complicated. That evening, as the sun faded behind the trees, I sat on the back porch with a blanket over my shoulders. The air had begun to cool as autumn settled deeper into Ohio. The backyard was quiet except for the distant sound of a lawn mower somewhere down the street. I watched the porch light come on automatically as darkness approached. I used to love this time of day. Thomas and I would sit together and talk about ordinary things, like what needed fixing around the house or which of our grandchildren might visit next. Now the chair beside me remained empty. A week after the meeting with the lawyer, something finally arrived from my family. It was not a phone call. It was not a visit. It was a message. The notification appeared on my phone late in the afternoon while I was folding laundry in the living room. The sender was Rachel. That alone felt unusual because Rachel rarely contacted me directly unless it involved holidays or birthdays. I opened the message slowly. At first glance it looked almost helpful. There was a list of names and addresses. Beneath them were descriptions of places with phrases like comfortable senior living, community dining, and professional daily care. Several of them were located within 30 miles of my house. At the bottom of the message Rachel had written a single sentence. She said that these places might be a better fit for someone in my situation now that Thomas was gone. I stared at the screen for a long time before setting the phone down on the coffee table. The house around me was completely silent again. For the first time since the inheritance meeting, the truth became impossible to ignore. My family was not simply busy with their lives. They were quietly arranging a new version of mine. And in that version, I was no longer part of the home Thomas and I had built together. I did not answer Rachel that evening. I left the message open on the coffee table beside my reading glasses and walked slowly through the house instead, as if seeing it for the first time. When you live somewhere for nearly 50 years, every room holds a memory, and memories do not disappear simply because someone sends you a polite list of retirement communities. The hallway still smelled faintly of the lemon polish Thomas used every Saturday morning. The living room still held the old blues sofa we bought when Daniel was 10 years old and insisted he needed a place to stretch out while doing homework. The house had never felt empty when Thomas was alive. Even during the quiet hours there was always the sense that life continued somewhere within these walls. Now the silence felt different. It felt watchful. I returned to the living room and picked up my phone again. Rachel had sent the message. Nearly 3 hours earlier. I read it once more, carefully this time, paying attention to the tone behind the words. She had used phrases that sounded considerate. She wrote that the communities offered excellent support, daily activities, and professional care. She said the transition would be easier if it happened sooner rather than later. The language was calm and organized, almost professional. But underneath that calm surface was something else. The message was not a suggestion. It was a direction. Someone had already decided what should happen next. I placed the phone face down on the table and sat quietly for a long time. Outside, the last light of the evening faded across the backyard. The maple tree that Thomas planted the year Daniel was born stood tall against the darkening sky, its leaves already deep orange and red. I remembered Daniel as a boy running across that yard with a plastic baseball bat while Thomas pretended to be the pitcher. Laura used to sit on the porch steps cheering loudly every time the ball rolled across the grass. Those memories felt so vivid that for a moment I could almost hear their laughter again. It is a strange thing to realize that the same people who once needed you for everything have slowly learned how to live without you. Later that night I prepared a simple dinner, soup and a slice of bread, and ate at the kitchen table where Thomas and I had shared thousands of meals together. I kept thinking about Rachel's message. She had not called. She had not asked how I felt about leaving the house. She had simply provided a list of places where I might go. That detail stayed with me. The next morning the sun rose bright and cold through the kitchen window. I followed my usual routine. Coffee. Toast. The morning newspaper spread across the table. But the thought of the message followed me through each small task. By late morning I realized that ignoring it would not make the situation disappear. I picked up my phone again and read the message for the third time. Then I noticed something else. Beneath the list of communities Rachel had added one more line that I had overlooked the night before. She wrote that Daniel believed it would be best to sell the house eventually because it was too large for one person. And difficult to maintain. That sentence was short, almost casual, but it carried more meaning than the entire message above it. Sell the house. The words sat quietly on the screen while I stared at them. Thomas and I had built this life piece by piece over nearly 5 decades. Every repair, every coat of paint, every birthday dinner and holiday morning had happened inside these walls. And now, less than a month after his funeral, my children were already discussing what to do with it. I did not feel angry in that moment. I felt something calmer and far more unsettling. I felt clarity. When people believe you are no longer important, they begin speaking freely in ways they never did before. I set the phone down again and walked toward the study at the end of the hallway. Thomas spent many evenings in that room during the last few years, sorting documents and organizing folders inside the large oak desk he had owned since his early career. He had always been careful about paperwork. Bills, insurance forms, investment statements, everything had its place. At the time I assumed it was simply his habit of staying organized. Now, standing in the doorway of that quiet room, I wondered if there had been another reason. The desk drawer slid open smoothly when I pulled the brass handle. Inside were neatly arranged folders labeled with Thomas's familiar handwriting. Property records. Insurance policies. Banking information. I ran my fingers slowly across the tabs, feeling the weight of each file. The morning sunlight stretched across the desk surface while dust floated quietly through the air. I did not know exactly what I was looking for yet, but something in Rachel's message had shifted my thinking. My children had already begun planning the next chapter of my life without asking me. That meant I needed to understand exactly what Thomas had left behind. And somewhere within the quiet order of those folders, I had the feeling that my husband might have prepared more than anyone realized. I sat down slowly in Thomas's chair at the desk, something I had not done since the day he passed away. The leather seat still held the faint creases from years of use, and for a moment I could almost picture him sitting there with his reading glasses low on his nose, flipping through documents the way he always did late in the evenings. Thomas believed in preparation. He was the kind of man who kept extra batteries in the drawer and wrote down important phone numbers on paper even though we both owned smartphones. At the time I used to tease him about it. I would say that the world had become digital and he was still living in a filing cabinet. Now, sitting in that quiet study with the sunlight stretching across the desk, I began to understand that his habits might have been something more than simple caution. The folders inside the drawer were arranged with his usual careful precision. Each one was labeled clearly with black ink. Insurance. Property taxes. Investment statements. I opened the first few out of habit, scanning the documents slowly. Most of them were exactly what I expected. Records of payments, copies of statements, tax forms organized neatly by year. Thomas had always taken pride in keeping everything in order. But as I continued searching, I noticed a smaller envelope tucked beneath a thicker folder near the back of the drawer. The paper was heavier than the other files, and Thomas's handwriting on the front looked slightly different from the rest. Instead of a formal label, he had written only 2 words. For Margaret. I held the envelope for a moment without opening it. The house was completely quiet around me. Outside the window a breeze moved through the branches of the maple tree, scattering a few early leaves across the lawn. The sound was soft, almost like someone walking across dry paper. I carefully opened the envelope and unfolded the document inside. At first the language seemed familiar. It referenced legal structures and financial accounts, the kind of wording Thomas had studied carefully during the last few years when he met with our attorney to organize the estate. But then I noticed something unexpected. The document was not simply a letter or an explanation. It was a formal addendum connected to the estate plan. And my name appeared again and again across the page. I leaned forward slightly, reading each line with growing attention. The addendum described a family trust that had been established quietly alongside the rest of the estate arrangements. I recognized the bank name immediately. It was the same regional bank Thomas had used for decades, the one where he still insisted on speaking directly to the branch manager instead of handling everything online. According to the document, the trust held a portion of our investments that had not been mentioned during the inheritance meeting with the lawyer. My first reaction was confusion. I had sat in that conference room only days earlier while the attorney explained every account and every distribution. Yet this document suggested that something important had never been discussed in front of Daniel and Laura. I continued reading slowly. The language was formal but clear enough to understand. The trust had been structured to activate under very specific circumstances. And the primary trustee listed on the document was not Daniel. It was not Laura either. It was me. I leaned back in the chair and looked around the study again, trying to absorb what I had just read. Thomas had always been thoughtful, but he was not a man who made dramatic gestures. Everything he did was careful and deliberate. If he created this trust without mentioning it during the meeting with our children, there had to be a reason. I turned the page and found another sheet behind the legal document. This one was handwritten. Thomas's handwriting had become slightly uneven during the last year of his life, but it was unmistakably his. The note was short. He addressed it to me directly. Margaret, if you are reading this, it means the paperwork has already been discussed with the children. I know how quickly situations can change after a person passes away. I wanted to make certain that you would always have the final word when it comes to our home and the assets we built together. Please speak with Mr. Henderson before making any decisions. He understands the structure of the trust completely. I read the note twice before setting it down on the desk. Outside, the wind lifted another small wave of leaves across the yard. The house no longer felt quite as quiet as it had before. A strange calm settled over me while I looked again at the document in my hands. Rachel's message from the day before returned to my mind. The list of retirement communities. The casual sentence about selling the house. She had written those words with the confidence of someone who believed the next step was already decided. But Thomas had clearly thought about this possibility long before any of us imagined it would matter. He had prepared something quietly, something that had never been mentioned in that lawyer's office while Daniel and Laura sat at the table reviewing their portions of the inheritance. I folded the papers carefully and placed them back inside the envelope. Then I looked at the small clock on the desk. It was just after 10 in the morning. The bank would already be open. And according to Thomas's note, there was someone who understood exactly how this trust worked. For the first time since the inheritance meeting, I realized that the future Rachel had described in her message might not be the one that actually happens. I did not leave the house immediately after reading Thomas's note. Instead, I sat at the desk for several more minutes, letting the quiet settle around me again. The envelope rested in my hands, its paper slightly warm from where my fingers had held it. Thomas had always believed in thinking before acting. It was one of the many things I admired about him. When Daniel was a teenager and made impulsive decisions, Thomas used to say something simple that stayed with me for decades. He would say that the calmest person in the room usually understands the situation best. That morning I decided I would follow his advice. I folded the document carefully and placed it back into the envelope exactly the way I had found it. Then I walked into the kitchen and poured another cup of coffee. The sunlight coming through the window was brighter now, stretching across the counter and catching the edge of the ceramic bowl where I kept apples. For the first time in several days the house did not feel quite as heavy with silence. It felt patient, as if it had been waiting for me to understand something important. Around 11 o'clock I put on my coat and picked up my purse. The drive to the bank took about 15 minutes. The branch was located near the center of town, in the same brick building where Thomas had opened his first account nearly 40 years earlier. He used to joke that he trusted that bank more than any new technology because the building had not changed in decades. As I parked the car, I noticed the familiar green sign above the entrance and the small row of maple trees along the sidewalk. The leaves there were turning the same deep orange as the tree in my yard. Inside the bank the air smelled faintly of paper and floor polish. A few customers stood quietly in line while a teller counted bills behind the counter. The room felt calm and orderly, the kind of place where people came to solve practical problems. I approached the reception desk and gave the young woman my name. I explained that my husband had been a long-time client and that I needed to speak with the branch manager about a trust document connected to our estate. She nodded politely and asked me to wait for a moment. A few minutes later a man in a dark suit walked out from a hallway behind the offices. He looked to be in his early 50s, with gray beginning to show at the edges of his hair. When he introduced himself as Michael Harper, I recognized the name immediately. Thomas had mentioned him more than once during the past year. Mr. Harper greeted me with a calm and respectful tone, the way professionals do when they understand a situation may involve recent loss. He led me into a small office with a round table and 2 chairs. Sunlight from a narrow window illuminated the stacks of documents arranged neatly on the desk behind him. I placed the envelope on the table and explained that I had discovered it in Thomas's study that morning. Mr. Harper listened carefully without interrupting. When I finished speaking, he opened the envelope and read the document slowly. His expression changed slightly as he reached the second page. It was not surprise exactly, but more like recognition. When he finished, he placed the paper down and folded his hands calmly. He said that Thomas had visited the bank several times during the last 2 years to arrange the trust described in the document. According to Mr. Harper, the structure was designed to ensure that I retained complete authority over certain financial decisions related to the house and a portion of the investments. The trust had not been discussed openly during the inheritance meeting because Thomas had specifically requested that the details remain private until I chose to activate them. I listened without speaking while he explained each part carefully. The language was formal, but the meaning became clear quickly. The trust was real. It existed within the bank's records exactly as Thomas had written. More importantly, it granted me control that none of my children had been aware of during the meeting with the lawyer. Mr. Harper asked if anyone else had seen the document yet. I told him that no one had. Rachel's message about retirement communities remained the only communication I had received from my family since the inheritance meeting. The manager nodded slowly as if that information confirmed something he already suspected. He then explained that if I wished to proceed, there were several steps available to ensure the trust functioned exactly as Thomas intended. Some of those steps involved updating account permissions and reviewing the property status connected to the house. The details were complex, but the overall meaning was simple. I had far more authority over my future than anyone else realized. When I left the bank about 40 minutes later, the afternoon sun had climbed higher in the sky. I sat in my car for a moment before starting the engine, thinking about everything Mr. Harper had explained. Rachel had written her message with quiet certainty, as though the next stage of my life had already been arranged. But Thomas had quietly built a different possibility long before that message ever arrived. And now, for the first time since his passing, I understood that the story my children believed they were writing might not be the story that actually unfolds. When I arrived home from the bank that afternoon, the house felt different again, but this time the silence no longer felt heavy. It felt steady. The envelope containing Thomas's document rested carefully inside my purse, and I placed it on the kitchen table before removing my coat. For the first time since the inheritance meeting, I did not feel like someone waiting for the next decision to arrive from other people. Instead, I felt as though a door had quietly opened behind a wall I did not know existed. I made a cup of tea and sat at the kitchen table while the late afternoon light stretched across the wooden floor. The maple tree outside the window moved gently in the wind, scattering another handful of orange leaves across the yard. I remembered the day Thomas planted that tree nearly 40 years ago. Daniel had been only 6 years old, standing beside his father with a small plastic shovel while insisting that he was helping. Thomas always believed that the best things in life grew slowly and quietly. Sitting there with the envelope on the table, I realized that the trust he created was exactly the same kind of thing. It had grown quietly in the background while everyone else assumed they understood the situation. Later that evening my phone finally rang. I was in the living room reading when the sound echoed through the house. The screen showed Daniel's name. I let it ring twice before answering. His voice sounded unusually casual, the way people sometimes speak when they are trying to sound relaxed about something important. He asked how I was doing and whether I had received Rachel's message about the senior communities. I could hear Rachel's voice faintly in the background of the call, speaking to someone in the room with him. I told Daniel that I had seen the message. There was a brief pause on the line before he continued speaking. He said that Rachel had only been trying to help and that the house might become difficult for me to manage alone. He explained that a smaller place with support services might be more comfortable in the long term. His words were polite, but the meaning was clear. The decision had already been discussed between them. I listened quietly without interrupting. Years ago I might have tried to defend the house or remind him how much of his childhood had taken place within those walls. But that evening I simply let him finish speaking. When he paused, I said something simple. I told him that I appreciated the concern and that I would think carefully about what to do next. My calm response seemed to surprise him slightly. He asked if everything was all right. I said that it was. Then we ended the call. After I placed the phone back on the table, I sat quietly for a few minutes thinking about the conversation. Daniel believed he understood the situation completely. Rachel certainly believed it. The message she had sent earlier that week carried the confidence of someone who already knew how the story would end. But now I understood something they did not. Thomas had quietly placed the final decision somewhere unexpected. The following morning I woke earlier than usual, long before the sun had fully risen above the houses across the street. The sky outside the window held that pale gray color that appears just before dawn. I made coffee and sat at the kitchen table again, this time with the envelope open beside me. I read Thomas's note once more. His handwriting moved slightly across the page, but the words were steady and clear. He had known that situations could change quickly after a person passed away. That sentence remained in my mind longer than the rest. Thomas understood people well. Perhaps he had anticipated the exact kind of pressure that Rachel's message represented. Around 9 o'clock my phone buzzed with a new notification. This time the message came directly from Rachel. She wrote that Daniel and she had been discussing the house again and wondered if we could meet later that week to talk about the next steps. She added that the real estate market in our area was strong and that selling sooner might be beneficial. I read the message slowly and placed the phone down beside my coffee cup. Outside, the first sunlight of the morning finally reached the top branches of the maple tree. The leaves glowed bright orange against the pale sky. For the first time since Thomas passed away, I allowed myself a small smile. Rachel believed the conversation was about selling the house. Daniel believed the decision would eventually become practical and unavoidable. But both of them were still working with the information they thought they had. And now, quietly resting on the kitchen table in front of me, was the document that changed everything. The message from Rachel remained on my phone throughout the morning, but I did not answer it immediately. Instead I moved through the house slowly, the way people do when they are thinking carefully about something important. The kitchen window was open just enough to let the cool autumn air drift inside, and the sound of dry leaves moving across the driveway carried faintly through the screen. For years this house had been the center of every holiday dinner, every birthday gathering, every small celebration our family shared. Now it had become the subject of quiet planning that did not include me. I washed my coffee cup, dried it carefully, and placed it back on the shelf where Thomas always kept it. Then I walked into the living room and sat down near the window that looked out toward the front yard. The maple tree stood tall there, its branches moving gently against the pale blue sky. I remembered Thomas standing in the same yard decades ago with a shovel in his hands while Daniel and Laura watched him dig the hole for that young tree. At the time we were younger than our children are now. We believed the future would always include all of us together. It is a strange realization to discover that time does not move forward evenly for everyone. Sometimes people move away from each other without even noticing. Around midday I picked up my phone again and opened Rachel's message. She had written it in the same careful tone as before, polite but direct. She suggested meeting on Friday evening to discuss the house and possible real estate options. According to her message, Daniel had already spoken with a local agent who believed the property would attract strong interest. I read the message twice and then placed the phone on the table. For the first time since Thomas passed away, I began to understand exactly how my children had been thinking during the past few weeks. They were not trying to be cruel. In their minds they were simply being practical. The house was large. The market was strong. A retirement community would provide services and convenience. To them it all made perfect sense. What they did not understand was that Thomas had already considered the same possibilities long before any of us expected them to matter. Later that afternoon I returned to the study and opened the desk drawer again. The envelope rested exactly where I had placed it earlier that morning. I took it out carefully and reread the documents inside. Each sentence felt clearer than before. The trust structure gave me complete authority over decisions related to the house and the accounts connected to it. No sale could occur without my approval. No transfer of ownership could happen unless I chose to allow it. Thomas had not written these protections by accident. He had created them deliberately. I closed the envelope and held it for a moment while I looked around the room. The study still carried the quiet presence of the man who had organized every folder and every paper with such care. I imagined what he might say if he were sitting in the chair beside me. Now. He would probably smile gently and remind me that patience reveals more than anger ever could. That evening I finally answered Rachel's message. I kept my reply short and calm. I wrote that Friday evening would be a good time to meet and talk. I suggested that Daniel come as well so we could all discuss the future together. Within minutes Rachel responded with enthusiasm. She said she was glad we could speak openly and that she believed it would help everyone move forward. The phrase move forward appeared again, just as it had during the inheritance meeting. I noticed that Daniel did not send a separate message. Perhaps he assumed Rachel was speaking for both of them. Over the next 2 days I followed my usual routines. I watered the plants on the back porch, walked to the mailbox at the end of the driveway, and prepared simple meals in the kitchen. But beneath those ordinary tasks my thoughts remained focused on the upcoming conversation. Rachel believed she was coming to discuss real estate plans. Daniel believed the meeting would gently guide me toward the practical decision they had already imagined. Neither of them had asked a single question about the documents Thomas left behind. Neither of them knew that the quiet authority within those papers rested entirely with me. On Friday afternoon the sky grew overcast and a light wind moved steadily through the neighborhood. I set the dining table with 3 plates and placed a small candle in the center, the way I used to do when family came to visit. The house was calm and orderly, exactly the way Thomas liked it. As the evening approached I placed the envelope on the table beside my chair. Outside, the headlights of a car slowly turned into the driveway. I could see Daniel step out first, followed by Rachel closing the passenger door. They walked toward the front porch together, speaking quietly to each other as they approached the house. From the window I watched them for a moment before standing up. Rachel believed she had come to guide the next step of my life. Daniel believed the conversation would be simple. Neither of them yet understood that Thomas had already written the final chapter of this decision long before any of us gathered around that lawyer's table. When I opened the front door that evening, Daniel smiled politely the way people do when they believe a conversation will go exactly the way they planned. Rachel stood beside him holding a small folder under her arm, and I noticed immediately that it looked very similar to the kind of folders real estate agents carry when they want to show market reports and property estimates. The cool autumn air followed them inside as they stepped into the hallway. Daniel gave me a quick hug, the kind that lasts only a second, and Rachel offered a warm smile that looked practiced and confident. I invited them into the dining room where the table was already set. The candle in the center cast a soft light across the wooden surface, and the familiar smell of roasted chicken drifted in from the kitchen. Rachel glanced around the room briefly, as though measuring the space with quiet calculation. She had always been organized, the kind of person who preferred plans and schedules over uncertainty. We sat down together and began eating, speaking about ordinary things at first. Daniel mentioned work and how busy the consulting firm had become during the fall season. Rachel talked about Ethan's school projects and the soccer tournament coming up next month. The conversation remained polite and calm, but beneath the surface I could feel the direction it was moving toward. After a few minutes Rachel placed her fork down and reached for the folder she had brought with her. She opened it carefully and slid several sheets of paper across the table. The top page showed a photograph of our house taken from the street, along with a printed estimate of its current value. According to the report, the property had appreciated significantly during the past 10 years. Rachel spoke confidently as she explained that the local market was strong and that similar homes in the neighborhood had recently sold within a few weeks of being listed. Daniel nodded quietly beside her, occasionally adding a comment about how large the house was and how much maintenance it might require for someone living alone. I listened calmly while they spoke, allowing them to finish every point without interruption. Rachel explained that selling the house could free up resources for a comfortable retirement community where daily responsibilities would be handled by professional staff. She described the amenities mentioned in the message she had sent earlier that week. Social activities, prepared meals, medical support if needed. To her, the proposal sounded reasonable and efficient. When she finished speaking, both of them looked toward me with the quiet expectation that I would agree. For a moment the room became completely silent except for the faint ticking of the clock in the hallway. I folded my hands on the table and looked at the photograph of the house printed on the page in front of me. The image showed the same front porch where Daniel and Laura used to sit on summer evenings eating popsicles while Thomas watered the garden. It showed the same windows that had glowed warmly every December when we hung Christmas lights along the roof. I let the silence remain for a few seconds longer before speaking. I told them that I understood the practical reasons behind their suggestion. Houses do require maintenance, and the future can bring unexpected changes. Rachel seemed relieved to hear those words, and Daniel leaned slightly back in his chair as though the conversation was moving exactly where he expected. Then I reached beside my plate and picked up the envelope that had been resting quietly on the table since before they arrived. I placed it gently in the center of the table between us. Both of them looked down at it with mild curiosity. I explained that while organizing Thomas's study earlier in the week, I had discovered documents connected to our estate plan that had not been discussed during the inheritance meeting. Rachel's expression shifted slightly as she glanced toward Daniel. He looked puzzled for a moment, clearly trying to remember whether anything like that had been mentioned before. I opened the envelope and removed the papers inside, smoothing them carefully across the table so they could read the headings printed at the top. The legal language filled most of the page, but the title of the document was simple enough to understand. Family Trust Addendum. Rachel leaned forward to read more closely while Daniel adjusted his glasses. I explained calmly that Thomas had arranged this trust during the past 2 years and that it had been designed specifically to protect certain decisions regarding the house and our remaining investments. The trust structure placed the final authority for those decisions with a single trustee. I paused briefly and allowed them to finish reading the first page. Then I told them that the trustee listed in the document was me. The room became very quiet again. Rachel slowly leaned back in her chair while Daniel looked from the document to my face and back again. Neither of them spoke immediately. Outside the window the wind moved softly through the maple tree, sending a few more orange leaves drifting across the lawn. After a moment I continued speaking in the same calm tone. I explained that according to the trust agreement, the house could not be sold or transferred without my approval. Any decisions about the property would remain entirely under my control for as long as I chose to live here. Rachel looked down at the document once more, her confident expression replaced by careful concentration. Daniel rubbed his forehead thoughtfully while rereading the lines on the page. For the first time since the inheritance meeting, the future they had already planned no longer looked quite so certain. Daniel continued reading the document in silence while Rachel carefully turned the second page, her earlier confidence replaced by a much more cautious expression. The candle on the dining table flickered gently between us, and the soft light made the legal text on the paper appear almost golden against the white surface. For several seconds neither of them spoke. Finally Daniel cleared his throat and looked up at me with a mixture of surprise and uncertainty. He said that he did not remember the lawyer mentioning anything about a separate trust during the inheritance meeting. I nodded slowly and explained that the attorney had followed Thomas's instructions exactly as written. Certain details had been shared with the family, but others were intended to remain private until I decided to reveal them. Rachel leaned forward again and reread the section that named me as trustee. I could see the moment she understood the full meaning of the document. The practical plan she had outlined earlier depended entirely on the assumption that the house would eventually become available for sale. Now the legal structure in front of her suggested something very different. Daniel asked quietly whether the trust meant the house could never be sold. I told him that the document did not forbid a sale entirely. Instead it simply required that the final decision come from me. If one day I chose to sell the house, the trust would allow it. But until that day arrived, no one else could make that choice for me. The room became silent again. Rachel closed the folder she had brought with her and placed it carefully beside her plate. For the first time that evening she seemed unsure what to say next. Daniel looked down at the photograph of the house printed on her report, then back at the real walls surrounding us. I could almost see the memories returning to him in the same way they had returned to me earlier. He glanced toward the window where the branches of the maple tree moved gently in the night air. That tree had grown alongside his childhood. After a moment Daniel spoke again, this time in a quieter voice. He said that he and Rachel had only been trying to make sure I would be comfortable in the future. I told him that I understood that intention. I also explained that comfort does not always come from convenience. Sometimes it comes from staying connected to the places that shaped our lives. Rachel listened without interrupting, her hands folded neatly on the table. The earlier confidence in her posture had softened into something closer to reflection. I continued speaking calmly, explaining that Thomas had spent many months planning the estate before his health declined. He had considered the possibility that the house might become a subject of discussion after he was gone. That was why he arranged the trust quietly, ensuring that the final decision would remain with the person who had built the home with him from the beginning. Daniel leaned back slowly in his chair and exhaled a long breath. The realization seemed to settle over him like a slow wave. For years he had thought of the house as the place where he grew up, but tonight he was seeing it again as the place his parents had created together long before he understood what that meant. Rachel finally spoke again, her voice much calmer than before. She said that she had not known about the trust and that her intention had never been to pressure me. I thanked her for saying that. Then I told both of them something that Thomas once explained to me many years ago. A home is not simply a structure of wood and brick. It is the place where time collects. Every birthday, every holiday, every ordinary evening when a family sits down together becomes part of its walls. That kind of history cannot be measured by market reports or property estimates. Daniel looked down at his hands for a moment before nodding slowly. The tension that had been sitting quietly in the room since they arrived began to fade. Rachel closed the real estate papers and slid them back into her folder without opening them again. Outside the window the wind carried another small wave of leaves across the yard, and the maple tree that Thomas planted so many years ago moved gently in the night air. After a while Daniel asked if he could take another look at the document. I handed it to him without hesitation. He read through the final section carefully and then placed the pages back on the table with a thoughtful expression. The future that he and Rachel had imagined earlier that week was no longer certain. Instead, something else had taken its place. A quieter understanding that the house, the yard, and the long history contained inside these walls still belonged to the person who had lived every chapter of that story from the beginning. As the evening came to an end and they prepared to leave, Daniel paused near the front door and looked once more toward the dining room where the envelope still rested on the table. The conversation we had shared had changed more than a single decision about real estate. It had reminded all of us that the life Thomas and I built together was not something that could simply be rearranged after his passing. Some foundations are stronger than people realize. And sometimes the quiet plans made by one careful man can protect a home long after he is gone.